Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the Illinois Environmental Council for our Clean Energy Town Hall. My name is Samira Hanessian, IEC's Energy Policy Director. And I am stoked to be your host tonight. As folks join the line, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. We are recording this town hall, which will be posted on our YouTube page. If you are uncomfortable being recorded on camera, this is your chance to turn yours off. All attendees are muted by default. Please use the chat function to ask questions, add comments, and provide resources. We will take live questions at the end of the session. And for those joining by phone, please use *9 to raise your hand. And finally, this should go without saying, please keep tonight's conversation civil and cordial. This is an educational event to learn more about the clean energy legislative work that IEC is planning for 2024. Any profanity, personal attacks, or disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. So please don't make me remove you from the Zoom line. Thank you again for joining us tonight and tuning into our Clean Energy Town Hall. Before we dive into presentations, I'd like to run through the obligatory about us and mission slide. Since 1975, the Illinois Environmental Council has worked to safeguard Illinois, its people, its plants and animals, and the natural systems on which all life depends by building power for people and the environment. Again, the focus of tonight's town hall will be on how we as environmentalists can impact the energy sector and create climate solutions, good climate solutions for us all. So with that, I would like to turn it over to, or introduce you all to Representative Ann Williams. And this is a woman who does not need an introduction. She has been an incredible climate and environmental champion for years. And Representative Williams is the chair of the Illinois House Committee on Energy and Environment. Like I said, she's been an environmental champion throughout her tenure. She's been an active member of the Green Caucus and has been a champion to ensure that we pass CEJA back in 2021 and the entire fight leading up to its passage. So just want to thank Rep. Williams for being on the line and for being a trusted voice in the environmental fight. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Rep. Williams.
Thank you so much, Samira, and thank you all for being here tonight. Big thanks to everyone at the IEC team. The introduction was lovely, and I am so grateful for your words of confidence, but I have to tell you, it has truly been an amazing team that I've been lucky to be a part of over the years in the General Assembly, and could not have done it without such a robust team of advocacy experts, grassroots advocates, and all my colleagues in the legislature who are very focused on energy, growing our green economy, and the like. So I didn't really prepare a lot of remarks, because if you're on the call tonight, you probably are pretty engaged in the conversation about clean energy in Illinois. But I was on a call a couple days ago talking about a geothermal pilot bill that I had worked on last session. And I gave kind of leading up to it, kind of background for people on the call from other states. And it was an interesting walk down memory lane, because while I was kind of highlighting recent legislative wins and topics that we are working on, I really noted the fact that over time, we have really grown, and we, meaning the environmental community, we have grown our advocacy efforts and our relevance and our role really in crafting this legislation. And I started talking at the other webinar about FEJA, the Future Energy Jobs Act. And that was probably one of the first times I really saw the environmental advocacy community have a real seat at the table and be incredibly influential as far as the final product. We all know that between the FEJA and CEJA, there were some ups and downs that we had to face, challenges with regard to some of the political corruption that was taking place kind of around the energy space, but we persisted. We focused on the policy issues. And as a result, of course, we had a big win in what started as the Clean Energy Jobs Act, evolved into the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, conveniently maintaining the same fabulous acronym. And we really, at that point, were running the table. We were working with a great coalition of stakeholders that I think really helped us hone in on priorities, negotiate a really great package. So these are our friends in organized labor, industry partners, the utilities, the consumer advocates, really to get a final product in a topic like energy. You're going to need to have everyone at the table. And I really am grateful for the collaborative work that we've done with those stakeholders. So stakeholders still remain the same. We continue to talk to those groups and organizations as we move on to the topics you'll be hearing about tonight. So CEJA, obviously an epic bill. It's not like we passed it. We can check a box and say we're done. Climate's taken care of. We got jobs. We're good. Obviously, we have a lot more work to do in terms of implementation. And of course, if you're paying attention to what's going on the legislative front, you've noticed that pretty much every session, there are attempts to make changes to CEJA. They're called to be, technical fixes, but really in some ways they're attempts to push back or get things in CEJA that were negotiated out of the bill for different reasons. So I like to think of CEJA as kind of a living, breathing piece of legislation, and it continues to take a lot of time and energy to maintain the gains that we've gotten in CEJA and to move us forward. So you'll be hearing tonight from some of the amazing experts in the field that are truly your eyes and ears in Springfield, getting the work done, backing up the legislators who there's no way we have the depth of knowledge as the folks do on this call. And I'm so grateful that they're there to really help us work through legislation and language and be our experts that we can call on when it comes to advancing our clean energy policies. So with that, I will turn it over for the program to start, but not before. I just want to say a thank you to everybody on this call, because I know, again, if you're on this call, you've played some part, large or small, in the evolution of the relevance of the environmental advocacy movement in Springfield. And I don't think I'm exaggerating to say, even in my short, relatively time in legislature versus the time that we've been talking about environmental issues, I've seen an amazing amount of momentum for our movement for clean energy policies, for clean air, water, and land. And it's exciting to see where we're going to go from here. Tonight, you'll hear from some of the top experts in the field and the topics we're really hot and we're talking about next session. And I will be tuning in so I can learn more from these great folks. So again, thanks everyone for your partnership. Thanks to IEC for having me on tonight, and best of luck, and I'll see you in the spring session.
Thank you, Rep. Williams. Just playing with the pens here. Okay. Thank you, Rep. Williams. Really appreciate you setting the tone and level setting us on the line here. Next, well, in terms of our agenda, I would like to briefly lay out what we will be going through today. First up, we will be covering carbon capture and sequestration issues. Pam Richard with Eco-Justice Collaborative will be presenting in a moment. Next, we will be talking about capacity issues with regards to the power sector. We have Christine Nanicelli with the Sierra Club and JC Kibbe with Natural Resources Defense Council on the line. And then finally, we will cover municipal electric utilities and cooperatives issues and transparency relating to those, as well as opportunities for a solar bill of rights. And we have Scott Allen with Citizens Utility Board, as well as Christine Nannicelli will join us again from Sierra Club. So that rounds out our agenda. We will have Q&A at the end. And with that, I would like to briefly introduce Pam Richard. Pam Richard is a land use and environmental planner by training and co-director of the Eco-Justice Collaborative, or EJC, a nonprofit based in Champaign, Illinois. EJC was formed in 2008 to work for solutions to climate change that integrate environmental, economic, and social justice, working collaboratively with other organizations and residents affected by fossil fuel projects, EJC managed to close 2 coal plants in Chicago, won a decade-long battle to move toxic coal ash out of Illinois' only national scenic river, helped pass the Coal Ash Pollution Prevention and the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, and more. And within the past 20 months, Pam helped found and now serves as the lead organizer for the Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines, consisting of 11 nonprofits and over 100 landowners working together to stop CO2 pipelines and carbon sequestration, which was first proposed by the Navigator CO2 Ventures, now canceled, and Wolf Carbon Solutions. And she will dive into all of those issues. So with that, Pam, I will pass it over to you.
Wow, thank you. And it's great to be here on this call tonight with all of you and have an opportunity to talk about something I feel quite passionate about, and that is carbon capture and storage. And by the way, that initiative in Chicago, if you didn't say this, Samira, was truly collaborative. And folks on this call, such as Christine Nannicelli, were really important in that initiative, which was restarted after negotiations had fallen apart with others. So anyway, I'm here to focus on CCS, and I'm here representing not just my organization, but also the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. And I want to say at the outset that this bill is essential to protect Illinois residents and everybody who lives and works here, right, from the potential harm and effects of carbon capture and storage. Our state is not prepared, and so that's why we have this bill that we're working on, and I'll be talking about tonight. But I want to underscore the fact that this is not a ban. We recognize this is coming, and as the funding is massive, we want to do our darndest to make sure that we have the protections that we need in place. So what the heck?
Before you dive in,
no. You cannot see the slides?
Cannot currently see the slides, no.
Let's try it this way. This is not a good thing, and I'm glad you told me that. So we'll try again. Okay, and now I won't go into the full screen mode. Can you see that?
Yes.
Well, this is where we'll leave it. And we'll just go this way. Okay, so what is CCS? Essentially, carbon capture, and I'm going to put transport in there in the middle, is the process of capturing and storing carbon dioxide before it's released into the atmosphere. It does not take anything out of the atmosphere that's already there. And I think a lot of folks think that that's the case. It just prevents more greenhouse gases from going into the atmosphere. And so once it's captured, it's compressed into a liquid state, a supercritical liquid at first, and then it cools down and becomes more of a liquid. And it's transported by pipeline to a destination where it's going to either be buried underground, or it also could be used for something else. And historically, that use has been for enhanced oil recovery. I will say at the outset that our current bill does not allow in advance EOR. And at least at this point, industry is saying that's okay. We're not going to fight that. So that's a good thing, because burning oil, of course, adds more. Whoops, this is not going to work, is it? Can you see that?
No, black screen.
All right. I don't know if
and it's back.
Yeah, it's back, but I can't. This is going to take me time. All right, let me try one more time. I'll go back to where I was. I'm so sorry, folks. We thought we had this done, and we didn't, but now we will. And we're just going to have to do it this way, and I think it will be just fine. Here I go. Share the screen, share sound, optimize video. Off we go. Okay. Except now I can't see it. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Here we go. Okay, so moving on to slide 2 here. Why now? Why Illinois? Well, it's not been profitable really until the recent Inflation Reduction Act. And in part, this massive influx of dollars and the amount of dollars that are now proposed, which is 85 tons per CO2 stored, it was increased by 70%. So there's lots of money in the CCS idea here. And Illinois happens to have the unique geology with its Mount Sandstone Reservoir and the shale caprock that folks think makes it a primary place to store it. And that's why industry is targeting it. So we know that Prairie State and other gas generating plants are looking at CCS as a lifeline for the fossil fuel industry because it allows them to continue doing what they do best, right? Burning the fossil fuels. So we're looking to see folks from within our state as well from outside our state importing CO2 into Illinois for storage. And then the Farm Bureau and other folks like the Corn Growers Association see this as an opportunity to continue ethanol with an eye on making sustainable aviation fuel. So that's why it's here. But CCS has been an abysmal failure. And I list all of these projects on the slide. I won't go through them, but most of us can remember when Illinois had something that we were talking about called FutureGen that started during George Bush's era and didn't get canceled into 2015. It was a real boondoggle. And the only project that is operating today that is a coal-fired power plant is the one in Canada called Boundary Dam. And it is not performing as well as expected. They say they cannot reach their goals. And it's also doubled the price of electricity. So far it's not done well. Another reason for the guardrails we'll talk about. And so what we want to do here is recognize that there's not adequate performance standards at the federal level to ensure CCS is an effective climate strategy. Just isn't there. It's like they put all this money out and they haven't done their homework to figure out how it's going to actually play out in real people's lives and in real locations like Illinois. And CCS could, in fact, prolong the life of the polluting industries that we know already place a burden on EJ communities, like Fisk and Crawford in Chicago. Those were dirty, old coal plants that were making folks sick. And so CCS requires either a new power plant to be installed for carbon capture equipment, or it requires the plants to run harder. Either way, there is more pollution coming out, and that can be a burden on EJ communities. It also requires an immense amount of water, especially at power plants. In fact, I think Jenny Castle from Earth Justice calculated that using the water that would be required to power CCS at Prairie State, the amount of water that would be used would be equivalent to that provided to residents in Ann Arbor for drinking every single year. It's an immense amount of water, and it's something we need to be concerned about. And then lastly, you know, if we make all these investments in CCS, and we do that now, which seems to be what's happening, right? That's going to divert critical resources away from renewables and what we know we need to do to solve our climate crisis. So there are guardrails in this bill that is being negotiated as we speak, that's been drafted by Earth Justice and Sierra Club, and in part from my organization. It's a great bill, and we're trying to get it through as much as we can, but we're in discussions with key stakeholders now. And the guardrails for carbon capture are these. One, we want to make sure that the capture efficiency rate stays at 90% to ensure that projects are really effective climate strategies. And it can be done. Industry has said it can be done. And that also we learned from talking to an expert. It can be done for cement operations as well as coal and other fossil plants. We want to make sure we do a life cycle analysis that takes into account upstream and downstream emissions. The worst thing we could do is to do a project that wasn't climate negative, carbon negative. So we want to make sure that we take that in consideration. We need an alternatives analysis. What else might you do to achieve the same level of CO2 reduction that might have less harm, less cost? Let's look at that before we go forward. Co-pollutant air pollution protections are key. As I said before, we want to make sure we don't increase those dangerous pollutions like sulfur dioxide and particulate matter and ozone. Water protections, we've got to have that water impact analysis, and we have to think about limiting water use in times of water shortage. And then most importantly, we really feel strongly that the whole process has to have a robust public engagement, but most particularly for environmental justice communities most likely to be affected. So moving on to carbon transport. As was just stated, their Navigator CO2 Ventures was the first to enter the arena here in Illinois. They were followed by Wolf Carbon Solutions that just filed their application with the ICC this past June. And One Earth Sequestration LLC just filed this month. But for a whole host of reasons, Navigator has canceled their project. Some of us feel we'll see them back again once the politics of their project wind down. They had trouble all through their whole project in all 5 states, but in Illinois here, they had received 2 recommendations of denial before they canceled their project. But in addition to this, we're expecting to see, now that we've been named a hydrogen hub, we expect to see that blue hydrogen, which actually converts natural gas into hydrogen and has a byproduct of CO2, is going to generate more CO2 for pipelines and storage. So why be so concerned about the CO2 stuff? What is it? It is in the air we breathe. I'm not going to deny that, says Wolf Solutions. Is it the same thing that puts the fizz in your soda? Well, I'd like to show you this quick video. 90 seconds is all it is.
This video shows a rupture of a buried, dense phase carbon dioxide pipeline. The experiment was conducted in the safe environment of the DNVGL Spade Adam Testing and Research Centre to assess the consequences of such ruptures in terms of mass outflow, crater formation and dense gas dispersion. The viewer should note that the extent of the visible plume does not necessarily represent the extent of the dense gas hazard.
So that's an example of an 8-inch pipeline, and the pipelines we're looking at with respect to the 3 projects that I spoke about are 16 to 20 inches and with the 8 inches for lateral. So it'd be much more than what you saw there in that experiment. So you decide if you think that the CO2 is like the fizz in your soda when you look at that video. Sadly, we know what can happen when a CO2 pipeline does rupture because it happened in Mississippi. That was a test. But what we know happened in real life in February of 22 when a pipeline well was stressed by soil movement after heavy days of rain. The rupture created a crater that was 40 feet deep. The CO2 plume that was released lasted for 4 hours and traveled over 1.25 miles into a very small town, an EJ community actually of Satarsha, Mississippi. Some of the things to know about CO2: it displaces oxygen, it hugs the ground, it follows low-lying areas. When people are exposed, they become intoxicated. In this case, they convulsed, and if they hadn't been rescued, many folks believe that several folks would have died. There were over 200 people that were evacuated by first responders. Many of that rescue happened on foot because internal combustion engines won't run. And 45 were hospitalized. Many have long-term health effects. So it's not something you want to mess with. And after that incident, PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, did an investigative report on that accident. And they announced that they were undertaking a new rulemaking process to increase safety and oversight. And that took place a little over a year ago. But the developers that are coming into Illinois are moving forward now. They're not waiting to take advantage of those new rules, and they want to move forward. And some of the things that I think are key that they're working on, that would be PHMSA's working on, is they want to work with pipeline design integrity, mitigate the long unzipping of pipelines that can happen when one ruptures, and most important, I think, is the modeling, to be able to tell what would happen in a rupture, where that CO2 plume model would go, what the concentrations of exposure would be, so that emergency responders can actually prepare and know what to expect. And that setbacks could be established by states, because PHMSA does not, they do not do routing. The state of Illinois would be responsible for doing routing and establishing safe setbacks. And by the way, that does not exist. You can't go to any book and say, if it's a CO2 pipeline, where should I be? And there are other impacts and concerns, especially I want to name, in addition to public safety. There are farm impacts. You can see them here. Farmers are particularly concerned about eminent domain because that's tied into both crop reduction yield from pipeline construction and public safety. And because this particular pipeline carries with it a hazardous waste and not a source of energy that I think they would support. There's also the potential for loss of tax base as opportunities for development are missed and property values go down because of proximity to a pipeline. Funding for emergency services, there is no money for that now. That would have to be borne by local, primarily volunteer entities. And then there's a question of long-term liability. If a pipeline ruptures, who's responsible? Who's held liable? This map is intended to say, even though I'm only talking about a few pipelines, that if we are to look at becoming net zero by 2050, there are 4 organizations who say there's going to be a whole heck of a lot more pipelines that will come our way. The Department of Energy suggests there could be as many as 96,000 miles of new pipelines built in order to take into account what would need to be done to become net zero with carbon capture and sequestration. And that compares to the 5,300 we have today. So what are the guardrails that we're looking at for CO2 pipelines? Well, we need that moratorium on CO2 pipelines until PHMSA completes its rulemaking. We need to have an analysis of geohazards that doesn't exist, so we can avoid the kind of subsidence that might happen over our mined areas, room and pillar mines that are subsiding across the state, the kind of soil instability that happened in Satarsha. Boy, do we ever need funding for emergency preparedness and grants for equipment and training. That's in this bill. We want to limit the use of eminent domain because eminent domain is supposedly there to be used as a last resort, not as would have had to be done with Navigator's project, to be used for the majority of a CO2 pipeline project. In Navigator's case, they had only secured 15% of the easements they needed, and 85% would have had to have been acquired by eminent domain if they'd been approved. And we need those safe setbacks. Somebody is going to have to make the hard decisions. How much concentration of CO2 is appropriate? How long can people be exposed? What are those acceptable thresholds of exposure, and what are the times involved that we need to be thinking about to make sure that people can self-rescue, again, without a vehicle, most likely, or be rescued. That's work that needs to be done, and no one's done it yet. And then, of course, in public engagement. And this is the last section here, carbon sequestration. Some key concerns, and this is a US EPA/DOE graphic on the left here. Sequestered CO2 can leak. Supercritical CO2, supercritical, has properties of both a gas and a liquid, and it is injected at very high pressure into the ground. It's more buoyant than the surrounding liquids, and it can escape through a whole host of things like abandoned oil and gas wells, fractures in the cap rock, or up along an injection well. And if it does escape, and if it doesn't come in contact with water, it will form carbonic acid, which eats away at the rocks in the aquifer, and that will contaminate sources of drinking water. And oh, by the way, if it gets released back into the atmosphere, why have we done this in the first place? We haven't achieved any objective. So those are some key concerns. And there are thousands of oil and gas wells across central and southern Illinois. This map on the left is a new one, and it only shows orphaned wells, those wells that are not unplugged, which total over 4,000. And DNR admits it doesn't know where they all are. And even plugged wells are at risk because the carbonic acid can erode the cement along an injection well casing. Old wells particularly provide a pathway for CO2 to escape containment and rise to the surface. And there was an example in 2016 when an old well did release CO2 near a school in Wyoming, requiring the evacuation of the school and shut it down for several months. We don't have to go really far to know that our geology proposed for storage here is leaking in Illinois. Learned today, and actually this is not the second time I heard it, that CO2 may be leaking at ADM's Decatur plant. We'll have confirmation of that as soon as we get the report. But suppose that what we learned today is that the CO2 has moved 1,000 feet closer toward the surface since it was injected in 2013. But even if we are still needing to verify that in writing, we do know that underground natural gas storage fields in the Mount Simon aquifer have failed. And here are some that are listed. The one in Champaign County probably has had the most attention. People were able to light their gas on fire. And the residents' water was contaminated in 2015, and because it's under the Muhammad Aquifer and no readily available supply of water is easy to find, those folks still are without water while the engineering is still going on. And in Ancona in Livingston County, that leak has been going on for over 25 years, and it's huge. I just wanted to show this slide, just not to go through it, but the highlighted orange pieces are showing you all what CCS projects are happening in Illinois. The orange is where projects, developers have actually applied to the US EPA for a class 6 well permit required to do CCS. So this is not a pie in the sky, one day it will come, it's here now. And there are really concerns over what could happen under the Muhammad Aquifer. Leaking CO2 could contaminate that aquifer as the methane did. And these are areas that are shown in circles. The one on the left is Navigator. They have not removed their sequestration project off the table. They're still holding on to it, and it encompasses 4 counties. And then the one on the right is One Earth Energy, and that would be in an aquifer recharge area associated with the Muhammad. And then there are earthquakes, both natural earthquakes and induced, that could in fact be large enough to break the seal of the capstone and re-release CO2. We need to be mindful of that as well. And there are key questions that remain unanswered that legislation needs to address. Who owns the pore space into which the carbon dioxide is injected? Not covered in our laws. Who owns the carbon dioxide after it's been injected? Not covered either. And who should be responsible for ensuring carbon dioxide stays deep underground or addressing a leak or well blowout if one occurs? You're all on mute, but I sure as hope you'd say the developer should be responsible and not the state. And so here are the guardrails that we've proposed for carbon storage. We do want to designate the surface owner of the estate as owner of the pore space. And we want to limit, just like you would in the eminent domain in the pipeline scenario, you want to limit the number of properties that must be acquired through the assembly of pore space. Our bill currently says everybody has to agree, but we recognize there'll have to be some movement there. We want to make sure that the US EPA Class 6 well regulations as they exist today are the threshold for an Illinois permit. There's a lot of movement happening in Washington to weaken those rules. We want to be as restrictive and actually stronger in a few areas. So we want to make sure that monitoring is stronger, for example, and we monitor for 100 years because it takes a long time for CO2 to become stable. We want to make sure that the confining zone does not interact with the seismic zone or fault area, does not intersect with the potable water, usable water aquifer, or any aquifer that's connected to one that's used as a primary source of drinking water. We want to make sure that we don't have any concerns about faults and fractures and abandoned or operating wells, mine shafts, quarries, or other features that could serve as escape paths. So these are stopgaps, safeguards in our bill. The liability should go to the developer. It should not be turned over to the state. And again, we want to make sure there's robust public involvement throughout. So our next steps, we've got a moratorium in the works that we're talking to Senator McClure about, who sponsored a moratorium in the last session. This time around, we'd like to expand it for pipelines and sequestration, tie it to the completion of rulemaking, tie it to the adoption of a comprehensive and protective CCS bill. That will require us to continue negotiations with the stakeholders, including industry, to get a bill ready and a moratorium ready too for the January, for the next legislative session. And of course, we're going to want to pass both bills, and we hope that everybody on this call will stay tuned for engaging with us to do just that. And that's all I have to say, and I'll stop sharing my screen and wait for questions at the end, because I think that's how we're going to handle it.
Thanks, Pam. Okay, just to keep things moving along in our agenda, need to work on pinning folks. Just to move things along on the agenda, we're going to move on to capacity issues. I'm going to share my screen here. Pin a couple of folks. Okay, thanks for your patience, everyone. I would just like to introduce our next two speakers. So we have J.C. Kibbe, who is an advocate with the Illinois Clean Energy, Climate and Clean Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. J.C. analyzes and advocates for policies that advance renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transportation, sustainable development, and grid modernization at the legislature, Illinois Commerce Commission, state agencies, and with other partners and decision makers. He also works to develop policy solutions to tackle climate change and to make the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy as equitable as possible for workers and communities. We also have Christine Nanicelli on the line. She is an Illinois campaign representative for the Beyond Coal campaign with the Sierra Club, Illinois. Christine is responsible for guiding the strategic direction of Sierra Club's Beyond Coal work in Illinois and making sure we transition away from coal and to clean energy. She works with staff and volunteer leaders to craft effective campaign plans and help coordinate the many capacities who are implementing those plans. Both JC and Christine were deeply involved with the development and passage of the Illinois 2021 Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA. And with that, I will pass it over to JC and Christine.
Awesome. Thanks, Samira. And Pam, tough act to follow. You guys got one of the most comprehensive walkthroughs of carbon capture up to the day of latest update, hot off the press from the Decatur site. So very impressive. Appreciate your leadership, Pam, and everyone else working on carbon capture issues. All right, let's switch gears and take a closer look at our power sector in Illinois and some of the next steps we need to really keep decarbonizing our power sector and make sure we have a really strong and resilient power grid moving forward. So, first slide, please, Samira. So, at the 20,000 foot level, we have made an extraordinary amount of progress. The overwhelming majority of the emissions reductions that we've made as a state in Illinois have come from emissions reductions in our power sector. That is because of the amount of coal that has come offline. Noting that pretty much every single privately owned power plant in Illinois announced its retirement prior to the passage of CEJA. Nonetheless, CEJA really establishes a critical backstop, an enforceable retirement date for privately owned coal in 2030, and then a series of other tiers as we work to get our gas fleet offline and eventually our publicly owned coal plants. And we might have a chance to briefly touch on those again in our next conversation about munis and cooperatives. But we've made a lot of progress here, but I think it's important to note there is still a long way to go. Yes, CEJA was predominantly a power sector bill, but this is not, there's still a ton of work to do. And there's a lot of implementation pieces here that need to continue to be addressed. I think I liked how Anne phrased it, sort of a living, breathing bill, thinking about CEJA that way, given the amount of transformation that we are seeing in the power sector and with our electric grid. So next slide. So as we think about some of the challenges here since the passage of CEJA, there's a few. It's important to remember that Illinois is not an energy island. We are a part of two regional energy markets and a vastly interconnected power grid, which frankly is incredibly outdated. And so as this transformation is happening, there are a couple of hiccups along the way, and we're trying more and more proactively to foresee what some of the challenges might be and making sure that we can take dirty energy, coal, gas, nukes offline as quickly as possible and replace them with clean, affordable, renewable energy. And the other thing I'd note that is, something that has evolved a bit since we first conceived of CEJA many, many years ago, we're starting to make progress in our other sectors. We're working to electrify everything. So I think an important way that I think about our power sector work, the goalposts are always moving. The more effective we are at electrifying buildings and transportation, our power sector goalposts are moving as well. And we need to be adapting to that as that happens. So next slide, Samira. And so these regional energy markets are responsible for overseeing our power grids and making sure that there is enough resources and power resources available on the grid at moments of peak demand, not just on the daily, day-to-day basis, but when we're really thinking about a big winter storm coming through or a heat wave and everyone's blasting their AC. And this is the type of thing that we talk about when we are talking about capacity. Capacity is really just a commitment from a resource, from a company with what it could be, a solar farm, it could be wind farm, gas plant, coal plant, nuke plant, but it's a commitment from that resource in advance to be available when called upon by the energy market during peak demand. And so this has become an important thing that we have had to really think through and account for in our work and in our CEJA implementation. And so each of these grids works and markets work a little bit different, but intended originally to incentivize new generation sources. PJM, MISO have created capacity markets that function a little bit differently, but all intended in theory, although not always in practice, to make sure that there is enough resources available on the grid to meet folks' needs in these really intense periods of peak demand, if that makes sense. And so next slide, Samira. In 2022, in the central and southern region of Illinois, we started to see some of these bumps in the road a little bit sooner, maybe than we had anticipated. But ultimately, there were a number of different factors that I'll pass it to JC to walk through. But we saw in the annual capacity market auction for MISO, there was a shortfall in meeting the projected amount of energy needs that MISO and the region that we are a part of really believe that was needed. Prices spiked because of that. There's a number of different factors as to why. This was also during, the invasion of Ukraine. So we saw a lot of spikes in fossil fuel prices, a lot of different contributing factors, but this played a factor as well in that, and increased the risk of rolling brownouts and certainly put strain on central and downstate consumers. So we need to figure out how to address these types of challenges more proactively. We anticipate more of these types of challenges are afoot as we get closer to 2030. And so we need to be thinking proactively about how to address these challenges. And that is why we are proposing a capacity bill that I'm going to pass it to JC to talk through what's causing these challenges at the regional and Illinois level, and how can we address them with state policy.
Thanks, Christine. We can jump to the next slide. So that was a lot to take in, but just echoing Representative Williams and echoing Christine, CEJA is not a perfect statue that just stays exactly it is forever. CEJA is a beautiful garden that we have planted, and we will be tending and watering and caring for in the years to come. And it's important that we take good care of it to hit all the things that we need to do. So Christine talked a bit earlier about the capacity crunch that we saw in the MISO zone. Reminder that MISO is the regional transmission organization that serves central and southern Illinois. They are charged with maintaining and balancing the grid, making sure that we have enough power and a reliable grid. But what's causing these issues? Well, the two main things. If you take anything away from here, it's that we need to upgrade our power grid. We need more transmission lines to get power from where it is being generated to where it needs to go. The kind of power grid that we need has changed over time. Just like you couldn't run, your iPhone and your mobile browser on the phone lines that they had built in 1900, you can't run a modern, clean, reliable energy grid on a power grid that was built for the 20th century. So we have to upgrade that grid. We need more transmission lines to transfer power from place to place, which will make our grid more resilient. It'll make it more affordable, and it'll help us bring clean energy online, because literally we need somewhere to plug it in. So the fact that we haven't done that as quickly as we needed to, we haven't upgraded those grids and we haven't upgraded the transmission lines as quickly as we need to is part of the issue here. So we're trying to run our clean energy economy on infrastructure that badly needs to be upgraded. The second thing is we are just not bringing clean energy resources online fast enough. We always knew that this was going to be challenging. Nobody said that solving the climate crisis was going to be easy, but we do need to move quickly here, and we've gained incredible momentum and we've made incredible progress in the last 10 years. But the story of addressing the climate crisis means that we always have to keep doing more. The thing that was unimaginable 10 years ago has to be regular 10 years from now. And so as fast as we've been bringing clean energy online, we need to bring it online even faster. So that means more wind and more solar, and particularly for this issue of capacity and reliability, pairing those resources with energy storage is really important. You'll hear our opponents sometimes say, well, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Well, it turns out that gas plants don't always run and coal plants don't always run either. The fact is that there's some intermittency in all of our energy resources. But when we pair wind and solar with energy storage, that lets us use that energy from when the resource is strong and deploy it when it's most needed. So for instance, with a solar panel that's paired with energy storage in the middle of the day at noon, it can be soaking up all that sun and it's providing all the power we need and more. And then it can take some of that power in the evening and use it for when everybody's going home, turning on their TV, running their microwave, whatever else. It makes those resources more flexible and it makes them better assets to maintain reliability and flexibility in our electric grid, which is really important. So that pairing with energy storage, that's a fast growing technology and a really important one that we can do more with here in Illinois. Second thing is energy efficiency. We could do more of that. We've made good progress on energy efficiency. This is not a big, new, flashy type of clean energy resource. We've been using it for decades, but there's still a lot more to do. It's the cheapest. It makes our homes more comfortable. It makes our bills lower. It's just a complete no-brainer solution. We should be deploying more of it in Illinois, particularly in central and southern Illinois. In the Ameren zone, for years, because of Ameren's effective advocacy in the legislature, Ameren has had lower energy efficiency standards than ComEd. That means that people in central and southern Illinois have a less reliable grid. It means they pay more on their bills. That's not right. People in central and southern Illinois should get all the same advantages of energy efficiency that we enjoy in northern Illinois. Lastly, demand response. This is shifting resources away from peak times when power is dirty, expensive, and scarce, and moving that to off-peak times when power is cheap, clean, and plentiful. Electric vehicles are a good example of this because it's very easy to control most of the time when you're charging an electric vehicle. So a lot of people have smart chargers where your vehicle knows how high demand is basically, and when it gets low and the power gets cheap and clean, it can switch on. That saves you money, it saves the grid strain, and it's its own kind of resource. It's sometimes called a virtual power plant. So there's a lot more that we can do to bring these resources online, and that'll help with our capacity issues, help with grid reliability. Next slide. So we know what's causing the issues. We know some of the things that can help. How do we actually take action in Illinois from a policy perspective to make sure that those things happen, that we know we need to have this clean, reliable grid that's going to help us have lower bills, solve the climate crisis, and breathe cleaner air? There's a few ways to do it. One, reducing peak demand using this demand response resource that I was talking for just a moment ago. And expanding energy efficiency as well, particularly in the Ameren zone. These are very affordable, no-brainer policies. We could be doing a lot more, particularly on energy efficiency in the Ameren zone, and just making it easier for people to use demand response, especially with their electric vehicles. Right now, you have to get a second meter in your garage, which you have to pay the utility to put in. If you want to do that kind of smart charging that I was talking about, we've got to make it easier, more affordable, and more streamlined for people to do that. So reducing peak demand is one way. The second is we just have to build more clean resources. One of those resources that you heard me talk about is battery storage. it does a lot of things on the grid. It makes renewable energy better. It makes things more flexible. A lot of other states have battery storage portfolios. That's not in our bill right now, but there's been one proposed by the renewable energy industry that has a lot of interesting ideas in it, and we're trying to engage productively with that, and we definitely see battery storage as an important part of our clean energy future. The other thing is we've got a great renewable portfolio standard in CEJA. We set a great path forward to the amount of clean energy that we're going to build over time. We're also digging ourselves out of a hole because for a lot of years, the renewable portfolio standard didn't work very well, especially during the Rauner years. So at the same time, we're trying to accelerate the amount of clean energy. We're also playing catch up a bit. And so there's still a few tweaks that we can make in the way that our state procures clean energy, just to make it easier, more efficient, and to help get more of that clean energy online quicker. So this is what I mean when I say CEJA is a garden. It's a beautiful garden, but we have to keep tending it, watering it, caring for it, and making some of these tweaks to the RPS as part of how we do that. Third, we need to upgrade the grid. We need more transmission, and we need grid upgrades to help get more rooftop solar online and things like that. We made some great progress in CEJA on that through the utilities integrated integrated grid plans. That's a good step, but we need to do more on the transmission side. And we need to use our leadership as a climate leader in the Midwest and the state of Illinois to push those RTOs that we talked about, those grid operators. They need to do more, and they need to hear from Illinois that we want them to do more because they need to listen to us. We're one of their constituents. So you've seen some climate deniers over in Ohio that have been trying to push on the RTOs to help these fossil fuels that we know are dirty and unaffordable. You know, we have to be a counterbalance to that. We have to be showing our climate leadership at the RTOs to help get more transmission built. The governor can do that. The Illinois Commerce Commission can do that. And there's ways that we can use legislation to help do that. Lastly, our state can better plan for our capacity future. This is a real wonky issue. We could spend a whole hour on this. And if somebody really wants to, I'll drop my email address in the chat and we can do it another time. I'm going to keep it high level, but just to say there's more we can do to plan further in the future as a state. The Illinois Power Agency is a good place where maybe they can look at some of this. We can plan further into the future at the state level for capacity and reliability, not just rely on the RTOs for that. We can think about ways to better use clean energy to meet our capacity needs, and we can just plan for that better generally as a state. So there are challenges ahead of us, but the good news is we have solutions, we have policies that we can use to get where we're going, and we need to keep tending that garden. So thanks so much for your time. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat here as well. I'll hand it back to you, Samira, for facilitation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, JC and Christine. Really appreciate that. We captured the questions from the chat and have those in the parking lot for Q&A a little bit later. Just to keep things moving along, I'd like to continue the conversation around our clean energy future and where we're going, but dive into the world of municipal electric utilities and co-ops. Christine is going to stay on the line with us. And I would also like to welcome Scott Allen. Scott Allen is the Citizen Utility Board's Renewable Energy Policy Coordinator. Scott joined CUB in 2014 as its first downstate staffer. And after the passage of CEJA, Scott's focus shifted from educating Ameren customers to advocating for the rights of owners and members of the state's publicly owned municipal cooperative utilities. I really can't say enough about all of our speakers today, so I'm going to cut myself off just in the interest of time and switch over to the other presentation. Give me one moment to flip.
All right, we ready to go?
I think we're ready. Does that look right to you?
I think that's it.
Fantastic.
All right, let's bring it home, guys. Municipal utilities and cooperatives. For those of you that perhaps live in an area that has a municipal utility or an electric cooperative, this is your moment at long last has come. Because as we know, there were a lot of things left out of CEJA, and really meaningfully addressing some of our challenges with munis and co-ops were some of those. So this is, I think, when I think about, we often talk about CEJA as winning the commitment for Illinois to get to 100% clean energy. I mean, the reality is, until we get our munis and cooperatives committed to 100% clean energy, Illinois has not yet made that commitment. So this is a really critical part of our power sector work and getting that 100% clean energy future that we want. So let's just do some quick level setting here. Samira, next slide. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the different types of utilities. So we've got three different types to get oriented around. The first are sort of your typical investor-owned utilities. These are your Amerins and your ComEds. They really fall under state oversight with the Illinois Commerce Commission and FERC at the federal level. There's a lot more laws and regulations that they have to comply with, and role that the state plays in just managing its overall power portfolio and procurement. Then we have municipal utilities, as well as co-op utilities. These are owned by people and members. There are, I believe, let me just check my notes. We've got over 1 million Illinois residents that are part of a muni or an electric cooperative. There are 25 separate cooperatives. There are 42 municipal utilities, and within each of those, you might hear references to joint action agencies, such as the Illinois Municipal Electric Agency and or GNT, Generation and Transmission, cooperative entities like Prairie Power or Southern Illinois Power Cooperative. I mean, these are really important power players, literally and metaphorically, in Illinois. And those are the types of entities that we're talking about here. And as of now, most of our energy policies, at least on the clean energy side, have really only spoken to investor-owned utilities. And so there's a lot of work here to be done around this remaining part of our power sector in Illinois. Next slide, please. And I think just a little bit more of to state the problem. Pam, some of our, I think I mentioned this maybe in our capacity bill presentation, but when we look at CEJA's decarbonization timeline, put at the very end of that timeline in 2045 are when publicly owned coal plants have to get to zero carbon emissions. And, part of that was, political, but also part of that is, two of these most significant polluters, the Dahlman Power Plant in Springfield and the Prairie State Plant in Marissa. These were two of some of the last two coal plants ever built in the United States. They were not being built by private companies. They were built by publicly owned utilities. It is that isn't an accident. It's also not an accident that these entities also happen to be considering potentially another poor investment in carbon capture, which brings us back to Pam's presentation and how carbon capture interacts with this issue here. there are significant decisions being made behind closed doors around what these resource portfolios are going to look like for munis and cooperatives in Illinois. But you see a trend. It is not an accident. Poor decisions to build these plants late when no one else was investing in coal, and potentially another poor investment decision for carbon capture instead of clean energy incentives. It really tells, I think, an important story of how these entities really lack transparency, democratic oversight, and proper utility planning that's really available for the public to participate in and to really have the necessary scrutiny behind this. And without those basic practices, as munis and co-ops are intended to have, really poor decisions can be made. Consumers are not adequately protected. And obviously, we have significant implications to our clean energy future and our climate. So these entities are still the most significant carbon emitters in our state. If we go to the next slide, Samira, we can take a look and see, this is just an example of the Illinois Municipal Electric Agency's resource portfolio. We've got Prairie State, just about 50%. Trimble County is another coal plant at 30%. It's an extraordinary amount of coal, and is not comparable with where we see market trends. That is the result of poor decisions. That is the result of a lack of democratic oversight and scrutiny and financial analysis, problematic policies as well in giving more ratepayers and customers access to clean energy options. So we know we can do better than this, and we're going to have to do better on this to really live up to our clean energy and climate commitments in Illinois. We cannot leave munis and co-ops behind. Next slide. So what are some of the solutions that we're looking to address here? First, transparency improvements. Really looking at municipal utilities and joint agencies like IMEA. Imposing basic record keeping and access requirements to ensure member municipalities are able to understand and monitor the economic value of our generation portfolio and assets. There are a lot of just basic challenges for ratepayers to understand how is their utility bill being spent? What is the economic trajectory of the Prairie State coal plant? Is carbon capture a good investment? There's just basic transparency issues that these entities have really shied away from and really tried to skirt around some of the Open Meetings Act that we think we can be holding them to a stronger standard so that there can be better oversight and scrutiny around these entities. Next slide. Additional transparency and democratic improvements for electric cooperatives. So we took a look at legislation that already passed in Colorado that really increases transparency and makes some of these critical democratic improvements in that state. So opening up all meetings from that legislation, improvements to their to their board elections. Oftentimes these are very opaque electoral processes. It's hard to know when they're held, how often, who's eligible to run. We think we can do a lot better, and it's important to give folks more access to having a say in their energy future on those co-op boards. Basic ethics improvements. These are pretty standard things, disclosing conflicts of interest, and understanding when funds are being spent on political lobbying. There were ratepayer dollars spent to lobby against CEJA when we had plenty of those ratepayers and legislators that were very much in favor of some of the policies that we were pushing for. So there's a real conflict and ethical issue there in how some of these entities are spending ratepayer dollars and engaging in political work. Next slide, and then I think I'm going to pass it over to Scotty. I think this is probably one of the most important pieces here: good governance and transparent democratic planning. The bread and butter here is to require integrated resource plans. I know that doesn't sound sexy, but it's really important. This is when these entities would take a look, and these are basic practices that happen with other utilities in states like Minnesota and South Dakota, where we take a look at projected energy needs, load forecasts. Are we going to be electrifying a lot or little? And taking a look at the different ways that we can, in the most cost-effective way, meet those energy needs. What's the right makeup of resources? What kind of demand-side management and energy efficiency programs can be working to really deliver the most cost-effective pathway for our customers, and taking into account different scenarios that might happen, taking a look at high gas price scenarios, low gas price scenarios. So these are really important types of practices that are responsible, fiscally responsible practices for entities to be making when really making huge decisions, as many of our munis and cooperatives are doing right now. Do we double down in coal investments and do a carbon capture retrofit at our coal plant? Do we do a gas conversion? Do we do a clean energy replacement and seize the opportunity of all of these direct pay incentives at the Inflation Reduction with the Inflation Reduction Act? Do we do a combination? All of these conversations are happening behind closed doors. We have not seen financial analysis, and they have profound implications for Illinois' energy future and for our ratepayers that are part of these entities. We know we can do better, and we need to be holding our munis and co-ops to higher standards. And the last key piece of this that we are really beginning to look more closely at, and putting forward a proposal to carry as part of this package, hopefully, is really addressing issues and access around solar for muni and cooperative ratepayers. Thinking about it as a solar bill of rights, to make sure that is available for solar for all, truly for all, not just ComEd and Ameren customers. So I'll pass it over to Scotty and maybe walk through a couple of some of the key components that we need to solve for on the solar front to give folks more access.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. So if what Christine talked about was kind of the larger level, the bigger problems, and what I'm going to talk about are more, these are things that concern individuals when we go out and talk to people and hear their complaints. These are the things that matter more to them, and their their personal finances. And to say too, thanks to Shannon Fulton on this call too, with Straight Up Solar and the Illinois Solar Education Association, we learn a lot of this information from her, and she's been working for years to try to help solve these problems. The problem is with these utilities, unlike with Ameren or ComEd, they're not regulated by the state, and there are no consumer protections. So we know exactly what an Ameren customer or a ComEd customer is going to get if they want to install solar, or if they want to access solar through community solar or solar for all. Those utilities are kind of forced to credit their bills, and we have standards for how much solar you can install on your house and how much it's going to cost to get the interconnection agreement. But with municipal and co-op utilities, it's all over the place. And prior to CEJA, people didn't even have a right to access solar. So their utility could tell them that, no, we're not going to let you interconnect to our grid, and that was fine. One of the small victories we did win in CEJA was saying that regardless of your utility, you can't be prevented from generating enough electricity to offset your load. What that term means exactly is a little ambiguous, but we should fix that at some point too. But part of the problem that we see all the time is one of the major incentives for going solar is how much you get compensated from the utility for over generating electricity. We know if you're a ComEd or an Ameren customer, the kilowatt hour that you send back to the grid is worth the same as whatever the price for a kilowatt hour is at the time. For a municipal or a co-op utility, that compensation rate, oh, sorry, my alarm is going off. That compensation rate can change at any time. And we have seen city councils or co-op boards decide that you put your system on and we were crediting you this much. Well, now we've changed our minds and we're going to lower what we credit. And so when somebody like Shannon goes and installs solar on somebody's house and said, we figure add up all these incentives, it'll take you about 7 years to recoup your investment in the system. Those changing in credits can move you up to 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And so there's no guarantee. Every one of these municipal or co-op utilities can change their policies whenever they would like. A lot of these utilities also have what we call it solar penetration limits. So they would say in a town of 4,600 people that once we hit 3% of our peak demand, or once 3% of our load is covered by people who have installed solar panels on their roof, we're going to go back and redo these policies entirely. And so there you've cut off access to people who can afford to install solar. The first to get in on that have a huge advantage to the people who maybe saved up for it for years, and things are just turned upside down. The grid planning, Christine talked about how important grid planning is, and this has a huge effect on individuals too, and it kind of ties into point D here, where without grid modernization and grid planning, one of the many reasons that these smaller utilities can't let somebody access a solar subscription program or won't take advantage of solar for all is because they don't have smart meters. So us ComEd and Ameren customers, we paid over the course of years, we still pay on our bills for those utilities to recover that cost. And Ameren and ComEd rolled out smart meters, and now we're able to send electricity back to the grid, and all of that can be accounted for. That is a critical piece of distributed generation on your house. We have to be able to track that, and it opens up some of the programs that JC mentioned earlier too, electric vehicle charging programs. We can't have any of that without these grid upgrades, and we can't really get these grid upgrades unless utilities are at least willing to plan. And we haven't gotten even to that point with most of these utilities, that they're not even willing to plan. The other problem is, if they were willing, it's not likely that they would know how to go about even doing that. Some of these utilities, they're controlled by their city council, their co-op board. They have very little experience with any of this, no expertise. And most of them have given away half of their function as a utility, which is supply. They're allowed to make their own electricity if they would like to. That's really expensive and it's complicated. So they let those joint action agencies like the IMEA, we'll let them worry about that. And so with that responsibility went all of the expertise that you would need to really effectively run a utility. So we need to do something about getting planning mandates. Just because you're a small utility doesn't mean that you should be stuck in the early 1900s forever. You still have to serve your owners and members. And then finally, this third-party ownership, that's kind of another blockage for bringing community solar or solar for all projects to these municipal and co-op utilities, those sorts of solar projects typically have, up to this point anyway, have required a developer to come in to build the project, and then Ameren customers can subscribe to that. So it's a third party, a developer, that owns those projects. And municipal and co-op utilities in the state, with the exception of one co-op up north, they don't allow third party ownership. They say in their agreements that if you want to install solar, or if you want to take advantages of solar, you have to own the equipment. And so that really leaves, if you want to take advantage, if you're a municipal or co-op customer and you want to take advantage of the clean energy economy, you better be able to afford solar. So any low income person, any person who lives in an apartment building are cut off from accessing the benefits of solar. And I think that we've seen a lot of stubbornness with these utilities that, well, first of all, Christine mentioned the Illinois Municipal Electric Agency. They require their members to sign 100% supply contracts with them, meaning that you will get your electricity from nobody but us. And if you were to allow a third party owner to come in and build some solar, maybe we'll sue you over that. So it's created a real problem with equitable access to solar and kind of unlocking some of the programs that CEJA and prior to that FEJA intended to offer to low income people, that all people in the state should be able to take advantage of these lower cost and cleaner and more ethically sourced power generation sources. So that is all I have for that. And Samira, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Christine. It was really informative. As I'm getting more familiar with the muni co-op issues, it's I'm becoming a lot more aware of how important it is that we have transparency all across the board. So I'm really glad that you're working on these issues. I'd like to move on to Q&A. So let me just put up a Q&A slide really quick. But if folks want to start raising their hands or dropping questions in the chats, we'll start taking questions from folks to any of our speakers. Okay. I have lots of questions and I'm trying to prioritize here. Oh, Renee Patton has a question in the chat. How are you all thinking about or working on policy relating to issues with mining and extraction of the minerals we need for clean energy?
That's a great question. I'm curious, JC, if you have thoughts on this.
So JC let me know he had to hop.
Oh, we did have to hop. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just share. I mean, I think this is something that needs increasingly, I think, more analysis around and figuring out how to incorporate that into our policy crafting. No question. So I think there's a lot of room to think about this more intentionally. Absolutely.
Right. And Renee had a follow-up question. Oh,
sorry, it was the same one. I just realized I just chatted it to you and not to the group, so I sent it to the group as well.
Oh, no worries. Thanks, Renee. And really great question. I see Dave has his hand raised. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I guess it's a follow-up from where Renee's question was, but with a little more detail. Some of our experiences so far in talking to some legislators is that their mindset when they talk about storage is fixated on batteries. And it's important to understand how many other kinds of storage is available. So the question is really how deeply are we as a movement, an environmental movement, looking into non-battery alternatives for storage and where they're more appropriate than lithium, for example. And also, how do we move some of the state agencies that are charged with economic development for the state and you know, those kinds of opportunities to get them to look in that direction, so we're not stuck in the lithium death spiral, which is a real possibility in the coming years, not to mention that it's an environmental justice, and as she points out in her question, a mining and degradation issue.
That's something I hear a lot from people who throw around various ideas, and I agree, Dave. I think that lawmakers do kind of get locked in because that's the main battery type that we know about, we hear about in EVs. But I will say that the city of Carbondale right now is working on about a $750 million energy project. And while they will have some batteries down there, most of their storage, they're proposing pumped hydro storage. So I think that there's a lot of people taking advantage of federal money that's available and not relying on lithium batteries for storage, and they're using the resources they have available to them. So
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, and Dave, I'll just offer that our decarbonization subgroup in the Clean Jobs Coalition is undertaking that very question as we speak, and really thinking broadly and brainstorming creatively around storage policies and what we could bring to the table. So I hear you loud and clear, for sure.
Thanks, Christine.
Yeah.
I have another question from Renee. We talked about the issues of municipal and co-op utilities. How are the presenters thinking about the benefits of those methods versus private companies that have the goal of making money for their stakeholders? It's a great question.
And I think about that a lot too, because I don't like people who make money on selling power to people. But I think the whole theory behind the publicly owned utility is that we don't need to regulate them, one, because they're not for profit, and two, because you don't have corruption at the local level. Why are there balloons on my screen? I don't know. But anyway, I think something that I've observed is that a lot of these private or publicly owned utilities, they tend to treat their utilities as if they were for-profit entities, for one. And the idea that there's no corruption at the local level is insane to me. Because I think that there's no evidence that shows that. So ideally, these utilities would be able to run themselves and keep up and not treat their utility like we need to figure out how to make more money off of it for the city of Springfield, for example, coming up with many schemes over the years. How can we sell our pollution to make fertilizer? How can we sell our pollution to do that? So that the whole idea of the nonprofit utility model, I think it would be great if we could enforce those principles somehow.
Yeah, I'll just offer, I think it's a great question, Renee. And I think in theory, there's obviously a lot of appeal in publicly owned utilities, but it really requires rigorous oversight and key practices and guardrails in place, because there are when we think of some of the when I think in the power sector, at least, of some of the like really bad investment decisions that have been made, I think, as I alluded to this in the conversation, they've been made by publicly owned utilities. You know, up until I think a year or so ago, I worked predominantly on power plants owned by independent power producers. And those entities are going to be a lot more skittish about making risky decisions because they have to find the financing and they have to report to shareholders. And so they're a little bit more risk averse. Publicly owned utilities can take a risk and then they pass those costs on to consumers to foot the bill. You know, the NRG power plants, the Vistra power plants, they can't pass their costs onto ComEd and Ameren ratepayers. And then, you know, I also think too, it's tricky in the instance of, we think about just transition and coal ash cleanup. I'm certainly not going to lose any sleep over, you know, any of those entities, Vistra Energy, needing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to remove their ash from groundwater. But when I think about CWLP in the city of Springfield, you know, there's a number of key considerations given that it's local community residents that are ultimately going to have to foot the bill of coal ash cleanup. And so I do think that leads to a bit more complexity. So I think it's a great question. I think it cuts both ways. What's abundantly clear is we've got to have better guardrails to around munis and co-ops to make sure that they're legitimately accountable to the public for the people.
Thank you both. Recognizing that we're a little over time, I wish we had more time because 20 minutes per issue area here just isn't quite enough. I do want to thank everyone for joining the line. And if you do have any remaining questions or noodle over dinner this evening and think of some things that you want to ask our experts, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll provide my email on the chat, but it's on the screen as well. We can get those questions over to our speakers. I'd also be remiss if I didn't plug our upcoming town halls. We have 2 left in our series. The next one is on zero waste. Liz Kunkel's on the line and she'll be leading that one on November 15th. And then we also have a sustainable agriculture town hall on the 29th. So please register for those and really appreciate your time and joining us this evening. Big thank you to all of our speakers and Representative Williams.
Thanks all. Have a good night.